Right, well, welcome everybody to what we hope is going to be a really interesting and informative meeting. We'll do our very best to that end, really to think about what is the offering of health economic modeling with respect specifically to what medtech innovations and developers of those innovations and devices are likely to require. And we'll look at really, ideally, the what. What do medtech innovations require? And how does that look? Why is that the case? And indeed, how might that be enabled through combining with health economic modeling practices and teams? To that end, I thought I'd begin just by the two speakers today introducing themselves. And I thought then my colleague Nick might be able to introduce himself first.
Thanks, Calum. So yes, I'm Nick Swart. I'm a senior health economist at MTEC Access. I recently joined the company, and in a previous life, I worked in academia as a health economist at University College London, working on a range of health economic subjects, mostly funded by National Institute of Health Research and other public funding entities.
Brilliant, thank you, Nick. And my name is Calum Jones. I am a consultant health economist of 8 to 9 years of experience within private sector health economic consulting. And as a rule, my job entails developing health economic models, typically within Microsoft Excel, leveraging statistical packages such as R as well, to essentially develop economic submission packages that are going to enable traditional therapeutic developers, big pharma or biotech, or indeed device developers in the medtech sphere to attain or to pursue and to attain reimbursement and or procurement within regional and national settings. And to that end, Nick and I sit within a team within MTech Access of 8 health economists, a strong team of 8, which has a broad range of technical and strategic experience, and is regularly, I'm delighted in the case of, we regularly combine with our experienced and rather large market access team within MTech Access to ensure that we have that holistic innovation to launch coverage of what therapies and devices are going to require in that pursuit of reimbursement and procurement. Naturally, with health economics, we are dealing principally with the generation of new evidence, both cost and benefit orientated, statistically analyzing that information, validating it, and indeed making sure that we translate the use of those inputs into models that produce outcomes of relevance to end stage stakeholders at the national and regional level. Today in our agenda, we hope to, as you can see here, walk through a number of different items. Firstly, thinking about why and in what ways do health economics and medtech represent a plausibly natural relationship. Then we can think about what do we have and see today that actually suggests to us that medtech is going to have to be perhaps stepping up to the plate in a sense in some way in pursuit of market uptake, but also to that end, the opportunities that are actually starting to arrive for medtech companies, which is the flip side of that particular coin. And then we can think about the types of economic models which health economic teams, such as ours, for example, could actually develop for medtech to enable a robust and appropriate submission packages is submitted for these purposes. We could then think specifically about how we conceptualize economic models. What are the core tenets that we look to touch on and consider? We'll try to make that a little more real, so to speak, by thinking about illustrative examples of how we would work with a medtech partner, or how any health economic team should work with a medtech partner at the very beginning of conceptualizing that key decision problem, the value drivers, the patient pathway, and so forth. And throughout, we welcome you please to submit in writing any questions that might arise, that you might have as we pass through the webinar agenda. I think we can move now to our first slide, therefore, where we would really want to touch on what we feel is a very natural relationship, an effective relationship that can exist between health economic teams and medtech developers.
Absolutely. And starting at the beginning, sort of a quick health economics 101. The entire aim of health economics is to facilitate decision making around whether to provide a new device or service or drug, The reason, obviously, or choose that one particularly over, say, another alternative. And the reason, of course, is that you can't do both. We are in a scarcity situation, so you don't have a finite amount of resources, so you have to choose either doing A or B, and economics or health economics will weigh up the costs and the benefits of both of those or more products or devices, and to inform that decision. Now, there are various standardized ways of doing this, various methods, which is rather nice for us, since we can the problems are often quite difficult and complex. So having a methodology that is standardized cuts a lot of difficulty out of that. And it's all sort of regulator driven and regulator approved. So in the UK, we would use NICE methods guidance for designing our models. And when those things get submitted, there's a checklist, in fact, a cheers checklist it's called, rather cheerily, to make sure you've ticked all the boxes, as it were. Traditionally, health economics has been sort of moved in step with pharma, or the development of and growth of pharmaceutical companies has gone hand in hand as conversations and interactions with regulators have increased over the years. But medical devices is rather new comparatively in that, but it's a very natural fit, and many of the sort of processes and methods that have been developed originally for pharmaceutical drugs also apply for evaluating and assessing health technology and health devices.
That's right.
Sorry,
well,
yes,
thank you. It's absolutely right, Nick. And part of the reason why we're enthusiastic, particularly enthusiastic, to talk about this subject now with you today is really we have a pretty fascinating development ongoing at the moment within the medtech appraisal sector, if one could refer to it as such, in that actually the evidence threshold bar is ever rising and will continue to rise as communicated by relevant bodies. Actually rather recently through updates that we'll touch on in a second, such that actually the similarity between the requirements of medtech developers and big pharma in bringing their assets to market for reimbursement and procurement are going to become increasingly familiar to one another. And actually pertinently to that, we've got two examples on this screen here, which you can see. The first being a code of conduct that some of you may be aware of. It's interesting, many are not actually, and that is from the Department of Health and Social Care. This code of conduct, which was formulated a few years ago and was actually updated in January of this year, is really providing a set of core principles that are fairly overarching, and they're all about really encouraging asset developers, specifically alluded to as data-driven healthcare technologies, to really focus quite keenly on the importance of value demonstration. That is, understanding exactly for whom your asset is being developed for, not just the target customer, so to speak, but also the patients for which you're interested in alleviating an unmet burden with. And indeed also, of course, therefore, picturing exactly where that device fits into a pathway, what evidence exists, needs to be collected, how you're going to collate and use that evidence, and to transparently present it. And we do feel actually the code of conduct is somewhat of a bellwether as to what we might start to see in other health technology assessment mature markets over the next few years. Principally because these are very logical steps towards considering medtech evidence. They are unambiguously productive steps and principles that we certainly feel wholeheartedly should be adopted by medtech asset device developers. When it comes to the Medical Technologies Evaluation Program, which is run by NICE, this is an interesting case because here in the United Kingdom, we actually have essentially a case where NICE are putting these principles laid out by the Code of Conduct into a form of practice, whereby actually there is this process, therefore, where NICE can appraise new medtech devices, their respective evidence submissions, and issue potentially useful for encouraging wider, broader, more consistent uptake for medtech assets, albeit in a non-legally binding sense. So as opposed to the single, for single TAs in the United Kingdom, where actually there is somewhat of a pseudo regulation that ensures that actually recommendations are implemented. It is true that the MTEP doesn't quite have those teeth, but nonetheless there is a route for gaining national accreditation through the MTEP process that we'll touch on in a second, and indeed the requirements for that we'll touch on shortly as well. I think then we could look just to the first of these 2 points that we mentioned, and that is really thinking about the code of conduct.
Well, the code of conduct, as it starts off, says really you need to start at the beginning, as I said earlier. You need to start with the decision. What is the decision you're trying to evidence, which in your case will almost certainly be, what are the benefits of implementing this device over an alternative, which may be another device, or it may be standard care, which is quite common, of course, in medical devices situations. There is no alternative. They can often be quite disruptive in a good way, of course, and therefore the comparator that you're trying to compare against is how much benefit does this device give, and how much additional costs does this device incur on the health system. And that's obviously on the sort of the decision problem there overall. Within that, of course, you're asking sort of what is the value statement that you're trying to sort of show here? What are the scientific outcomes and the clinical outcomes? What are the outcomes on patients and indeed on workforce or on patient their own pockets? The sort of the financial impact of the system as a whole, and the ultimate question, is this value for money? Is this device cost effective relative to the comparator? That is the be all and end all really of what health economics is about.
Excellent points, and actually it's worth stressing that, of course, different medical devices come with quite understandably their own esoteric offerings of alleviating unmet need, patient burden. And given the indication, the disease context into which they fit, naturally, therefore, the value drivers specific to each individual device will differ. You see across various different devices a highly heterogeneous spread of different value claims that they will then, in best practice, go on to seek to demonstrate through economic modeling. But indeed, in some cases, of course, it might be the case that the value associated with a new device is going to be principally financially orientated. It's about shortening a pathway, perhaps, to reach ultimately treating and alleviating the pain, perhaps, that's experienced by a patient. It may also be quite clear that it's going to reduce a number of adverse events, heart attacks or migraines and so forth. And we might want to capture that in some way. And perhaps, as Nick alluded to there, value for money, combine that into some kind of ratio of value, thinking about how much extra financial output are you going to have to put out for an additional unit of benefit that could be attained with this device, all from the perspective, of course, of a decision maker within a national or regional position. And to that point, whilst the code of conduct is adamant of the importance of medtech assets being quite clear on the importance of defining that decision problem, really nailing that down, really trying to understand what benefit in value terms this asset, this new device, can offer relative to its closest comparators. Once you've done that, it's then important to, in a formal, structured, and in a transparent manner, to create evidence that is touching on those relevant parts, of course, clinical, social, economic, behavioral, holistic, societal, and so forth. It's about then translating that into a series of structured iterative processes within a model that allow people to explore and characterize and test the inherent uncertainty of your assumptions, your sources, your references, of costs and benefits, and to really credibly appraise, therefore, your core base case assumptions and outputs, and to test, of course, around the parameters, the margins for error around those base case assumptions and outputs, just how credible your story is. These models, and what the code of conduct is alluding to inherently, these models are therefore all about making sure that you can have a clinically and economically robust argument for your new asset that reflects that appropriate decision problem value drivers that we've articulated previously. And the degree or the type of arguments you're going to be making, just to these two bullets you've got on the right-hand side there, or two of these, will differ probably to the type of stakeholder that an asset developer is going to be, a device developer is going to be approaching at the national level, certainly in the UK, but this would probably apply elsewhere as well, particularly as time goes by. We're probably looking at a cost and health benefit consideration, the consideration of both, not necessarily in value terms, perhaps in separate domains, cost and benefits, but certainly some consideration of both. At the regional level, you're typically looking at some form of demonstration of budgetary impact. For example, you introduce a new device into a portfolio of devices or portfolio of care assets, treatments that a budget holder is responsible for, and you assess, really, if you introduce this new device into there, how does that change the overall budgetary picture for that budget holder? I think we can move now just onto MTED, actually, the Medical Technology Evaluation Program. And what's actually really, what enthuses me and Nick, I'm sure, about the MTED process is that we are at a stage now in the United Kingdom, at least, whereby we actually have a fairly clear and structured set of directions and guidance and stipulated requirements from MTEP with respect to what kind of economic model ought to be developed to demonstrate the value over that of comparators for the new device, and also in the ways in which, and exactly the kinds of inputs and sources that ought to be collected and put into those models. Some salient points here we might want to make here. It's great to see the crossover between MTEP and the code of conduct that we've just mentioned, in MTEP explicitly requesting the delivery and articulation of a clear decision problem, where you're really looking to make perfectly evident exactly what benefit or effect this new device is going to introduce into an existing treatment paradigm. And to that point, actually, is it going to be within a treatment paradigm, or is this new device going to somehow change that treatment paradigm? Is it going to sit somehow alongside and differ in some ways from that treatment paradigm? So it's capturing really what's the story there, how is it going to work, and why is it necessarily delivering benefit over comparators? Now, the next bullet down, cost-consequence analysis. Now, that's a little bit jargony, for which I apologize at this stage, but in essence, what that's capturing there in its definition is just really that we see MTEP requiring device companies to deliver evidence that speaks both to the cost or the costs associated, the resource use associated with that new device, as well as the expected health benefit. So, of course, thinking about, for example, the alleviation of ailments, that could be any kind of adverse event related to the device indication. We could also be thinking, of course, not just about, for example, I used the example earlier of avoiding number of heart attacks or migraines or so forth, but we could also be thinking about health service benefits as well. That's what MTEP looks at as well in its criteria. For example, are we looking at this device reducing the length of hospital stay that the relevant patient cohort is experiencing? Indeed, subsequently, the number of hospitalizations, and indeed also what's the burden, perhaps of the alleviation of burden that we might see in the inpatient, or certainly the outpatient, or indeed the primary care consultation context. I think Nick might want to touch just now on our right-hand side section here.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Calum, and thanks for the illuminating walkthrough there. As Calum said, the MTEP sort of application process sits within the NICE Health Technology Assessment, or it is a route through NICE Technology Assessments. It is relatively quick compared to a single technology appraisal, or indeed multiple technology appraisals, which are the two other routes that you can go through NICE. But the MTEP is specifically focused on medical devices, which is why we are sort of discussing it here. As I say, it's relatively quick, and the design of it is staggered. First, you have to sort of present clinical evidence through the process, and then afterwards you have to present economic evidence, and that is sort of the structure of it. Basically, if you're considering this, I would very much encourage you to sort of get your analysts or your health economists, such as ourselves, on board as soon as possible, because that process is quite quick. And from the word go, you want us to be hitting the ground running in order to meet a rather tight deadline. And so before as we're sort of just starting off that process, just have those 5 bullet points there very much lined up. You know, the decision problem needs to be characterized. You need to know your device. You need to know the standard care probably that you're trying to replace, or you're arguing for replacement, or the alternative. You need to know exactly where the value of your device lies. You need to have your evidence all lined up, particularly the clinical evidence, because that comes first, at least in the requirement submission process. And that all needs to be collected and readily available. If there's any new evidence that's going to be generated, that's marvelous, but again, it needs to be quite short term in terms of when you're going to get that data in order for use in the MTEP process. And in the same way that you sort of identifying the sort of key value drivers of your device or technology, you need to really establish what the costs and the benefits are going to be in that whole picture there.
That's right. Yeah. At an early stage, you're absolutely right, Nick. And what Nick and I are alluding to here actually is we feel very important actually, hence our little exclamation mark in the top right there. It's really because time and time again, what we see, not every time, of course, but it is completely understandable because this is all fairly new territory for medtech companies, but it is a common pitfall to be quite a long way down the line of contacting regional and perhaps even national, perhaps even international stakeholders who could grant reimbursement and uptake, and recommend uptake rather. And they have got down that line, but they haven't yet ticked a number of boxes. So for example, it's quite conventional for key value drivers to be hypothesized and acted upon at that late stage. By which time, of course, and this speaks to the next point I was going to make actually, which is by which time it's actually rather difficult to prospectively collect the adequate data to support that, to make that case in an evidence-based, robust fashion. To that point, it's critical to, as soon as possible, identify exactly what evidence you perhaps as a medtech device developer, what evidence you currently have to support your defined decision problem and value story, what the data gaps are, and how you're going to fill those gaps, and why as well. And we can't stress enough how important it is to start early in that endeavor. Absolutely should pay off in spades. The trouble is, for example, with the MTEP project process, if you enter that process and you haven't quite sorted those things out, and also perhaps you're not quite, you don't have much of a preliminary idea of what your likely cost impact or your benefit, comparative benefit is, your profile in that respect, you might already be in a position which one cannot back out of being assessed and a recommendation which may not be favorable being cast on the basis of an evidence submission which has inadequate evidence and is actually producing or providing a cost or benefit claim which ultimately in itself is not doesn't put the company in a very good light. To be clear, getting one's ducks in a row, getting them in order at an early stage with respect to these matters is imperative. And I suppose that's actually the main thing actually in this whole webinar I'd like to emphasize, but I won't dwell further. I think that's surely clear enough now. What we'd also want to touch on, of course, with MTEP is what comes out of it. What does it really matter? And the thing with MTEP is, as I did touch on the fact, of course, relative to a single technology appraisal, these are not legally binding recommendations. It's not the case that if a medtech device is granted a recommendation for use, that subsequently trusts and hospitals across a given country are now mandated to some degree, unless without great reason, to reimburse and procure and provide those assets. And I say that because that is essentially what is the case in a single technology appraisal situation. Single technology appraisal situations came about really to reduce essentially unevenness in postcode prescribing, or indeed postcode prescribing. But there is no such infrastructure or teeth yet to the MTEP recommendation package. That may come, of course, but not yet. And I just wanted to touch on this table here. You can see that there are, of course, 3 nuanced forms of recommended for use, one in which your case for adoption is fully supported. And there are instances, absolutely, not unusually, of medtech devices that, for example, are currently being represented and sold in a few hospitals within a given market, and 6 months to 12 months later are actually in 2, 3, 4 times that number. So the power of an MTEP NICE recommendation for use can be quite potent. There is also the case for partial support for this, where we're looking at recommendation for use in specific circumstances, or indeed more of a contingent recommendation, where it's for use in specific circumstances, or actually where further evidence might be required to unlock perhaps further specific circumstance opening. It's also worth noting, just before I pass to Nick again, that it is the case. If you go into MTEP, the process, there is the risk of recommendation that highlights that this is a non-recommended for adoption MTEC asset. And that must be borne in mind before essentially taking what is a risk-benefit assessment when going into the MTEP process. That does require, as we said already, ample preparation and determined consideration as to the pros and cons of entering that process. Nick.
Thanks, Calum. Now, not to sort of emphasize too much the sort of the scary side of the MTEP, but just the point being that the MTEP is quite stringent in its requirements, and one of those is you have to demonstrate that your device, or your the effect of your device overall, it would be cost neutral or indeed cost saving to the system that you're trying to implement it in. And as Calum said, while the MTEP might not have the same mandate that single technology appraisal does, you would still come out at the end of it with a recommendation for use by NICE, which goes a long way. And it's something that's a feather in your cap, if you will. You know, when it comes to sort of trying to pitch your device to decision makers, it is certainly something that would hold quite a lot of weight. So yes, on top of the need to demonstrate cost neutrality or indeed cost savings, you also need to demonstrate at least equivalent clinical benefit, or indeed greater clinical social care benefit to get it through the submission process and to get that recommendation for approval.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you, Nick. And I think, so we've covered, of course, some of the underlying context as to what health economists do on a day-to-day basis, and what medtech device developers are increasingly being encouraged, or indeed in some cases, of course, required to develop in terms of evidence packages for submission. Code of conduct being somewhat the carrot, and there's a little bit of stick and carrot within the MTEP process. If we move on now to a more practical, a particularly practical consideration, which is, what are the economic models that health economic modelers like Nick and I, like the MTEC Access team, could actually be providing for medtech assets in their pursuit of market uptake opportunities? So what we wanted to do actually was to make this a very sort of, I suppose, user-friendly screen here, where one can see side by side the pros and cons, the features and the advantages and disadvantages of three very conventional types of health economic models, which we feel are particularly relevant to the needs of medtech devices going forward. What I wanted to touch on initially is the fact that, of course, these three model types, a budget impact model, a cost consequence model, which we've touched on already, of course, is what's required in the MTEP process, cost consequence, and also a cost effectiveness model. These model types are all focusing on slightly different objectives. The budget impact model, very much looking on a financial basis from the perspective of a budget holder, looking at a relatively short time horizon of 3 to 5 years. And that differs quite notably from the idea of a cost consequence model, where we're actually thinking about, as we've touched on briefly, costs and outcomes. So two different concepts there, of course, but the idea of cost consequence is that we keep those quite rigidly separate, that we have separate domains, a disaggregation between cost and outcome. And we consider what that means. What, in essence, that kind of model is going to be telling you, well, you're going to have this much incremental or difference in cost compared to the standard of care. Also, we're going to avoid this many adverse events. So they're separate considerations, but it's just something more to contribute to the story. And then the cost effectiveness model, very much looking at combining in an efficiency sense, the cost and benefit relative to its comparators of this new medtech asset. So thinking about how much more do we have to spend to attain one more unit of the health benefit that we are targeting. It's also important to note two more things, that these models are all comparative. So it's all about this new medtech device relative to the single or indeed the collection of existing standard of care interventions. And also worth noting that from left to right in this table, budget impact through to cost effectiveness model, broadly speaking, what you see there is an increase in degree of sophistication, resource intensity. Yes, I think I'll now just walk through what a budget impact model really entails. I've touched on the fact, of course, that we're looking at a short-term cost comparison. And it is important to note there that the principle of that is a budget holder sits there with their portfolio of projects of products in front of them. It's costing a certain amount over 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 year. They're very cognizant of that. And then a new developer comes along and says, we'd like you to purchase this, please, with this accompanying evidence. Some of that evidence is a budget impact model. And what that budget impact model will show is that in the current world, you are spending this with this portfolio of assets. If we introduce this new asset into your portfolio with a certain uptake, so a certain % of the market uptaken by that new device, and increase that perhaps slightly over time as we see market uptake increase, how does that over time affect the overall budgetary balance that the budget holder in question is going to experience? That's what that's all about. And therefore, the target audience in this case, we call a payer. Now, a payer is a very nebulous term. It's not the best thing to say. We're really talking about commissioners within clinical commissioning groups. For example, in the United Kingdom, or increasingly probably going to be primary care networks, we're talking about commissioners within hospitals at a more regional or local level. A payer will also be, for example, the National Institute of Care and Health Excellence. So we're talking about also about the Scottish Medicines Consortium, bodies like that, payers, those who have some degree of determination as to where funds are allocated within a given system, be it local, regional, or national. BIMs, the acronym being obviously a BIM for a budget impact model, we call them BIMs. They're easily understood typically by decision makers. They're quite intuitive. They tend to be because it's frankly feasible to build a budget impact model that is very transparent, nicely signposted, probably quite aesthetically striking and so forth. It's of the 3 models here, it's probably the easiest to convey and communicate an output. As we said, the time horizon is rather short. It does compare costs principally as a focus between the different interventions. We are not really at a risk of cherry picking positive results, but we will touch on that, Nick will, on the next model. Typically, it is acceptable to populate a budget impact model, typically, but not always, with a form of evidence that or evidence gathering that is called a targeted literature review. Targeted in that it's not systematic, it's not considering all by a certain set of inclusion and exclusion criteria available papers out there, peer-reviewed published papers that could inform our assumptions, our costs, our benefits, and so forth. But rather targeted, where one goes to the most self-selecting sources through publicly available, typically, databases and select data that is found over a certain time period, so for perhaps 5 or 10 days of searching by an analyst team. It's worth noting that all of these models are certainly in the Medtech device context co-developed by that health economic consultancy and the Medtech developer, because as we'll touch on later, the incremental power of a model being conceptualized not only by experienced health economists, but by the people, of course, who have been integrally invested in heaving and bashing out that very specific and important value story that they understand better than anybody. Combining those 2 expertise bases makes for a very potent set of argumentation thereafter. The delivery timeline, roughly speaking, between 3 and 5 months. Some budget impact models are more complicated than others, hence we might expect perhaps 6 months in some cases, 2 months in some cases. But roughly speaking, I'd say 3 to 4 to 5 months is about right.
Thanks, Calum. So as Calum said, the 3 of these models, we chose these ones because they are a good illustration, we feel, of the various different ways health economics can how health economic analysis can be conducted to evaluate a medical device. There are other models as well, but these are sort of the main ones, and particularly the cost consequences model for the MTEP process. Each of these is also approved methodology by technology assessment bodies like NICE. And when we said earlier that things like the MTEP and medical device requirements in terms of evidence are sort of getting increasingly demanding in line with pharma. This is largely what we mean. There's just that recognition that health economics has a role to play in assessing medical devices, similar to pharma. Obviously, they are the device and a drug are completely different, and we absolutely appreciate that. But the methods for evaluating them are nonetheless approved methods such as these. Now, a cost consequences model, which is the requirement for the MTEP, the way it works is it disaggregates your costs and outcomes effectively into two think about two columns: the costs on the one side and the benefits, the outcomes on the other. And each of those would then be further disaggregated. You know, the capital upfront costs, cost to secondary care, cost to primary care, for example, those sort of things. Cost effectiveness model will sort of combine, rather than the output being a disaggregated costs and benefits, tries to combine both of those into one single metric of cost effectiveness that is all encompassing, could be used to compare more broadly and more generally. Now, the target audience for both of these, the cost consequences tends to be payer and societal, you're trying to capture those societal benefits and the payer benefits as well. Cost effectiveness will be broader and look at a much more general and holistic picture. And because of the additional complexity of the cost effectiveness model, you could argue that the cost consequences model is much easier to understand. You have your list of costs, your lists of benefits, and if you want to look at cost and benefits there, you sort of divide one by the other, which is why if you look further down, you could argue that it's risk of cherry picking positive results by choosing the smallest costs and the biggest outcomes and dividing through, whereas cost effectiveness is much more, it's done already in that cost effectiveness metric. Now, the time horizon, in other words, the length of time that you expect to accrue costs and benefits from your device. In cost consequences, it depends. It's variable, very variable, largely on the device. It is dependent still on the device and sort of the outcomes from it in the cost effectiveness model. But there is this tendency to look long-term or lifetime, particularly, such as quality of life and life expectancy and these sort of things. In the cost effectiveness model. Both models and the budget impact compare cost between interventions. Both can look at quality of life. Cost effectiveness is much more of a requirement, particularly for cost utility analysis, which is a form of cost effectiveness. And cost consequences, quality of life would just be an outcome that you could then compare against. Cost effectiveness tends to be very subjective, whereas cost effectiveness can be much more generalized and can be therefore used to compare across sort of countries, for example, or across disease health landscapes. In terms of the level of evidence required, in other words, going into what you need to go into the model, I guess there's two things to think about there. One is, do you have all the evidence that is required? Do you have your efficacy evidence? Do you know the effect on the population? What proportion of people are affected by this? Are there sort of subgroups that would be better benefited? These sort of things, as well as the outcomes and the costs. Do you know the price of your device? Do you know how much maintenance or training or uptake? These sort of questions all come into those. And one way we get that evidence, and one requirement of the technology assessment bodies, is to do a systematic literature review or a smaller targeted review in the case of cost consequences model, or a full-on network meta-analysis in the case of cost effectiveness, to review all the evidence and see how it lies. Again, as Calum said, the code design is a huge piece of this. I should also say that there's also a lot of cooperation, or at least a lot of contact points between your medical device company, yourself, us, and the NICE bodies that would be assessing them. So there's a lot of back and forth between all three to make sure everyone is on the same page when it comes to evaluating your technologies. And the delivery time reflects the complexity of each of those models.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Nick. And I think now we can think, okay, these are the model types which are pertinent or most relevant potentially to, and actually not just potentially, but in our experience, are relevant to medtech device developers. But then what are the broad stroke concepts and principles that underlie how we look to conceptualize from the very beginning a new health economic model? And it would be worth noting quite explicitly that this is exactly what we'd look to do live, in effect, in a room, in a workshop with medtech developers. But these are the core principles, and they're not actually specific necessarily just to medtech development. This is very applicable to the big pharma, medtech, and biotech sectors as well, for developing any health economic model type. Now, what we have are these 5 steps, and you'll note, of course, that much of this is exactly what we've covered incrementally in bits, so to speak, across this webinar. But therefore, I'm pleased to sort of complete something of an arc here by saying that, firstly, it is imperative to decide, or determine rather, exactly which populations are likely to benefit the most from your intervention, your new device. And indeed to understand why. I mean, that rationale will be questioned. And we're thinking in terms of population with respect to which ages, categories are we thinking of? Is gender of note? Is ethnicity of note? Are there disease subsets, indications that are going to be playing a role here in terms of either just base case analyses or any scenario analyses we want to run? And perhaps we're interested in different regions in a country, but not others, maybe different countries. When it comes to the value drivers, we've touched on this already, of course, but the idea really is thinking about what are those core positive differentiators that you expect this new device to espouse in effect, to demonstrate over the existing set of interventions that you are essentially looking to compete against within the patient system, even if that compete against involves some degree of complementary augmentation of the current system. What are those key differentiators in a positive sense? And then with respect to the patient pathway, I mean, this is absolutely centrally critical to any health economic development procedure, where really what we're looking to do is to map out step by step exactly how, I think I've touched on this already, but it is so important, map out exactly how that device fits into the existing paradigm of care, of treatment, patient progression, treatment rollout. And indeed, in which ways does it differ? And are there any aspects by which that new device is actually going to be affecting, in a change sense, the existing system? Are we looking actually at systemic change being affected by a new device? And that's really pertinent in medtech devices, even more so in my experience and opinion than in pharmaceutical. Because actually so many devices are, and this is why they're so exciting to us, are unlocking brand new opportunities. I mean, this is so often the case that there is unmet need that is frankly untapped insofar as what we need in many cases is a step change in the way we are delivering care. Many devices speak exactly to this need, and therefore defining acutely this patient pathway, this treatment pathway, is integral to this conceptualization process. It involves a lot of drawing on whiteboards where we consensually agree between the MedTech developer team and the health economists. Yes, this line goes to this health stage. We then move here. We then have clinicians who intervene at this stage. Maybe a subset of patients will go here. If you see what I mean, it's a bit like a decision tree, only in many cases a little more complex than that. But it's trying to map out where people go step by step. And then lastly, once we've got that drawn out skeleton of step-by-step patient progression, we then want to identify what are the costs, the savings, and the health benefits which we're likely to, in reality, experience and witness through the rollout and uptake of this new intervention, and exactly where will they be accrued or accredited to that patient pathway. And indeed, actually, some assumptions at this stage as to for whom they may be accrued and accredited. That speaks back to our characterizing of the population, of course. And maybe there's a time aspect on that. Maybe we have initially, in the short term, quite a few costs and benefits would be accrued, but then we need some clinically validated rules which state that actually later those health benefits and those cost benefits will not be relevant. Now, this is all to do, of course, with this is all early stage conceptualization between the developer and a health economics team. The ideal thing thereafter would be to validate, of course, the assumptions and questions that come out of this process. This process, incidentally, typically being undertaken in a workshop of 2 to 3 hours, something like that, where we can sit down together and really bash it out in a structured fashion. And we'd look to validate the outcomes of that workshop with some clinical experts in the field who are able to, of course, take a balanced, objective view as to whether this would actually pass SALT, pass muster, when it's submitted to the target stakeholder in question, for example, for NICE in the UK. I wonder, sorry, I might pause and see whether my colleague Nick would like to add anything to what I just said.
No, I think you covered it very well there, Calum. And I think since we are a bit pushed for time, we should roll on to the next slides.
Of course, thank you, Nick.
So here we have an example of what you can expect, or the sort of the approach we take when working with you through your situation, through your device, through your expectations of it, and then the sort of data we would need for the model. So on the left side, on the left column here, you see the various items we need, and this is sort of a very standardized thing, the PICO as it's called, PICO, population intervention comparisons and outcomes, and then an additional 5 items that we would need for the health economics. So the first column is this fictional product. I'll take you through it, and while I'm doing that, just think about what data you have for your own device, for your own product, and then you can start identifying where your strengths and weaknesses are in terms of the data and the evidence you have. So this is a fictional product. The target population is adults with dry eye syndrome. Now, the intervention is a novel device to alleviate this dry eye mask. It is a it is an eye mask. So rather nice, simple, contained. Now the comparator, it would just be current practice, standard of care, because there's no other devices that are currently on the market or in used in practice to address dry eye-ness. Their main outcomes are this clinical outcome, which would be the number of patients that meet this clinical criteria, and then of course quality of life, because this is obviously it's always with patients at the end of the day, and patient values and what patients want is a big part of all decisions on new devices, new technologies, new drugs, and of course the costs of doing this, and that would be the capital costs, the maintenance cost, any training costs, and where those costs might fall in terms of the different health providers and in this particular pathway. Now the perspective in this case would be NHS. One could take a more narrow perspective and just look at a trust, for example, or a hospital. It doesn't necessarily, or rather than a national health service, whether it's in the UK or abroad, or you could take a broader perspective as well and look at societal costs that patients would accrue. Even little things like parking at a hospital, for example, would come into that sort of broader societal perspective. Now the evaluation method for this was identified as a cost effectiveness analysis, because they want to look at quality adjusted life years, so cost utility analysis particularly. This is a metric that's very common in health economics to measure quality of life in a robust way that lets you compare across disease populations and devices, but we don't need to go into the details of that here. The time horizon, 1 year. In other words, we expect the costs and benefits of this to be accrued over 1 year and no further, and there's no additional modeling to extrapolate that beyond, and so therefore no discounting long term. Again, rather technical, so I won't go into details on that because they may not apply to your situation. The benefits would be valued in terms of quality adjusted life year, as measured by this idea of the EQ5D, which is a questionnaire to look at quality of life. And the evidence base from this primarily comes from this one paper, Griffiths et al., which provides direct costs and intervention use data. This is most likely a health economic or costing analysis, since it has costs and outcomes or intervention use in it, but it's by no means the only source of evidence that would be used or needed for a model. This would just be your main, probably RCT, given the various hierarchies of evidence preferred by technology assessors such as NICE. I think that's anything else to add there, Calum?
I think that's marvelous, Nick. Thank you. And actually, what I'll add as we move on to just a second and a 2 of 2 example is really the inherent importance of I suppose what we're trying to show here is this, of course, is to some degree mimicking a workshop that we would hold with Medtech device developers. The idea is we'd sit down and really try to fully conceptualize from start to end exactly what is desired to be achieved, who this would be delivered to, for whom, what the methods would be, what evidence is required, what do we already have, what are the gaps, what are the methods we're going to use actually to fill those gaps, and how are we going to validate this. And of course, what we're doing therefore is actually speaking back to, or referring back actually to what I said earlier, and that is the most impactful value stories always are, and you can pretty much tell actually with any given submission that you weren't even involved in, are ones where actually the developers were right at the center of the early stage conceptualization, that the buy-in was equal on both sides. What you're doing, you're co-establishing core assumptions, core areas of uncertainty, core understandings of data availability and gaps. and core understandings of exactly how this patient cohort that you're interested in is currently treated and how that might change with your intervention. That's what we're really trying to ascertain in these processes. And similarly here, again, using the same structure of what's called a PICO, population, interventions, comparators and outcomes, as well as the perspective, who's interested, who are we delivering this to, evaluation method, what kind of model are we using, for how long are we modeling, time horizon, benefits valuation, what's the basis of our valuation here and what evidence do we use? So in this case, we could be looking at this is a bit of a value story here, another fictional precedent where we look at nasal polyps in German adults, the incidence of those, and then we think there's a novel device that could remove nasal polyps within the primary care sector, that in effect a GP could, upon an initial consultation, remove that nasal polyp with a device. This, by the way, is entirely fictional. The current standard of care in that case, hypothesized here, is going to be a multiple healthcare professional sequence of care. So imagine that actually at the moment, what happens as a system problem in effect is that you present to the doctor, the GP says, yes, indeed, you may actually have nasal polyps, it looks that way. I'll send you to doctor number 2, which might be secondary care. That secondary care doctor may confirm it. They may send you back to a GP for then a referral to a 4th doctor in the secondary care system. And by the way, this is quite a standard problem that medical devices are looking often to alleviate, to shorten that care pathway. It saves a lot of time and decision-making stress, frankly, on the part of doctors and nurses. Now, okay, so we have that current standard of care. It's quite clear what we're doing there. We're cutting the length and the resource intensiveness of treating this problem of nasal polyps. Perhaps what we're interested here then is we're thinking, okay, it's a shorter process. So we're thinking about what's the difference in costs that we're going to be looking at between this new intervention and the current standard of care. How many primary and secondary care visitations are we going to avoid? Perhaps also we can think about some separate health-orientated benefits, such as the number of migraines avoided. It's a fairly arbitrary example, but I hope you see the point there, that actually we can consider these two things quite separately, potentially, and that speaks to this evaluation method we put there of a cost-consequence analysis. In this case, in this German case, with the perspective being the German national insurance provider, a cost-consequence analysis could look to compare these costs and to quantify entirely separately in different domains, just like as we would prepare in the MTEP process, the Medical Technology Evaluation Program in the UK, to prepare those costs and those benefits, in this case, comparative costs and the number of HCP visits avoided, the number of migraines avoided, consider them separately, present primarily the cost difference, but also supplant the value story and arguments with these fantastic resource alleviating benefit to the system and to the patient. It's plausible in this case, if you have nasal polyps, that we're thinking that people with nasal polyps perhaps have nasal polyps or a risk factor that's likely to encourage nasal polyps reoccurring all their life. Therefore, it's plausible for this model to consider a lifetime horizon. That's because we think that the costs and the benefits associated with this new device are going to be plausibly relevant for that entire lifetime. That's how long you want that horizon to last. Really, whatever captures the totality of the effect. Now, if we start patients at age 30, which I'm just trying to, I suppose, give an example of why you might start at a certain age. You might justify starting at a certain age like 30 because actually this is where the incidence becomes particularly notable in nasal polyp development, and prevalence starts to become established in a very real sense. And because we've got a lifetime horizon there, we might actually assume that people don't age beyond 100 years. That's a very conventional assumption, again, as well within health economic modeling. In this case, I think of principal value here would be demonstrating or sourcing event risk ratios. Some may be familiar with hazard ratios, odds ratios, essentially just quantifications of the expected probability of experiencing a given health benefit, a health effect or problem, adverse event such as migraines, or the probability of successively visiting sequential hospital visits or doctor visits. So what's the likelihood of you going to a primary care doctor and then also getting to a secondary care doctor and then a third and then a fourth, i.e. completing the pathway. So we'd be looking at a number of different risk rates to account for how to characterize real world progression down these two different care standards. And then the evidence base almost certainly for consequence analysis of this sort, it would be probably reasonable to be looking at some form of structured, targeted review of peer-reviewed published literature to gather our transition probabilities, the rate at which patients move between doctor to doctor in this case, and so forth, and also gathering our costs and our benefits, the risk of migraine and so forth, from the target market of interest, in this case, Germany. So essentially, as we conclude here, what we're trying to show, therefore, is that precedent, although hard to sometimes identify, use, and attain within medical devices, is, wherever you can find it, absolutely pivotal to that early stage conceptualization of your device's value. What has come before? What were the critiques that perhaps have been issued by credible bodies in the past? What were the benefits or advantages that people espoused of those analyses in the past? And actually, what are the crossovers between that analysis and yours? It's not going to be one in most cases. You might be thinking of several prior analyses that are sort of similar to what we might want to be doing with this new device in question. And we need to think, what can we take in terms of the best parts there? What do we want to avoid in terms of pitfalls? And in what ways is this completely novel? And are we going to have to seek additional input, perhaps from clinical workshop boards and alternative thinking as well? So yes, I just wanted to end on that general principle of using precedent to also inform how you proceed. I think we just moved now to our questions page, Nick.
Yes, thanks. So a lot of you were kind enough to submit some questions when you registered for this on a whole range of things, but we've tried to collate those into the ones that came up most frequently. And those are these three topics or themes. So the first question being, this type of evaluation is expensive. Is there any way to do it more cheaply? I'm not sure about readily, but certainly cheaply. So as we said earlier, so it depends what, if you're going through the regulatory process, then the MTEP in the UK, for example, is less resource intensive and quicker than the single technology appraisal, so therefore the cost of that will likely be cheaper. And on the same sort of note, as we showed through the budget impact, through cost effectiveness, the less complex, less resource intensive evaluations will be cheaper to commission than the more complex, more expensive ones, at least through consultancy. Now, obviously, I would be remiss if I said or didn't mention that if you want, you can always go through research pathways, find a research institute that would be interested in evaluating your product, and through them apply for grants through, I don't know, NHSX, for example, if you want to do public funding that way, or National Institute of Health Research or other bodies. Just keep in mind that the timeframes for those research timeframes are a lot longer than the consultancy timeframes. So the sort of the monthly, the 4 to 6 months that we cited earlier would not apply in the research context at all.
Yeah. That's really great, Nick. Thank you. And this second question here was quite commonly brought up actually by participants. And I'll just touch, before we mention this, we received quite a lot of questions, both prior to this webinar and during the webinar, and we will be delighted to get back to you on an individual basis to address your question. So we do thank you for those and apologize for running out of time in that respect. But this second question, what are the challenges in modeling medtech devices compared to drugs? Principally, it's data availability. And it's principally actually stemming from the esoteric nature, the novel nature of medical devices. It is often the case that there is a real paucity, an absence of prior analyses that could be leveraged effectively, usefully for these analyses, and therefore actually data that's already been established in systematic or targeted reviews and published in national appraisal body websites isn't actually that readily prevalent, whereas for traditional pharmaceuticals it somewhat more is. This is also a challenge compounded by the fact that actually medtech devices, by their nature, and it's entirely understandable, being smaller bodies than pharmaceutical bodies, don't always have the finances and the expertise in-house to design and run essentially adequate randomized control trials that could attain that data as well. So I think drawing out a totally novel pathway for an esoteric medtech device and adequately populating that with data, that's a little tougher in medtech than in pharmaceuticals, but eminently feasible nonetheless. Lastly, there were a few questions to this end. How do we find a friendly health economist who would like some advice or input into study design? I'm sure you won't mind me saying that we'd be delighted to be that friendly health economist. Indeed, if you'd like to explore absolutely any support that we can give for your innovation, please do let us know. We can offer no obligation free consultation meetings at your request. Please just drop us an email to that email address. Similarly, anything that we covered today that's crossed your mind and any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And with the LinkedIn page there, that has details of all our previous webinars. And we're short of time, so I'll close and thank you so much for attending today. And we're very grateful indeed.
Thank you.